Thank you very much, Eva. Thank you for the nicest introduction ever. And hello, everybody. My name is Tomasz Samojlik. It's a pleasure and honor to open the first edition of Białowieża Ecology Conference. And in this humble talk, I will aim at summing up almost 20 years of research into the environmental history of Białowieża Primeval Forest, especially aiming at answering the question, the burning question, how come this forest is still around, despite all the human presence, all the disturbances, all the dangers that loomed above this forest. But let me start by saying, okay, wrong button. By saying great expectations. We researchers probably know the best that this is the thing we face on a daily basis. And please believe me that I feel it the most at this very moment. And if you think that now I will tell you how to live up to those great expectations, I'm not the person. But I'm the person to tell you that we might find comfort in knowing that not only we go through such feelings and not only we are facing great expectations, but also places even as famous as Białowieża Primeval Forest itself. So I went online and searched Białowieża Primeval Forest in Google Maps, and I realized that people review the area, which is amazing, because then I sorted the reviews and checked the lowest ones. Talking about great expectations, right? So this is the funniest, because people sometimes review the forest with 1 star, saying, yes, it's really hard to get by. Other people say something about mega traffic jams, which I find really interesting, because if we have a traffic jam around, this makes the news, definitely. And it happens maybe once a year. Then the other reviewer says it's too expensive. I don't know, maybe, depends on where do you go, where do you eat, what do you eat. The other reviewer says too cold. Right, like 20 degrees outside, maybe for somebody, no, just joking. Depends on the time of year you visit Białowieża Forest. The other says, an overrated place, but if you like trees, there are plenty of them here. And I think this is the 5-star review. Come on, I love trees. I love to have them around. But listen, the last one sums it up the best. Kann man sich sparen, which probably means that you could have saved yourself the trouble of coming here in the first place. So when I hear such complaints, when I meet such people, but I usually don't, if I would meet such people, I would answer with one simple graph. Bang, mic drop. This is the pollen research of Białowieża Primeval Forest. Analysis of a pollen core extracted from a bog in the middle of the forest, depicting the last 12,000 years of the history of vegetation of Białowieża Primeval Forest. Of course, that would not end the question with reviewers like those one from the previous slides. So I would have to explain it a bit more detailed. Palynological research is currently the best method to analyze the history of vegetation of a certain place. And in case of Białowieża Forest, 2 things are most important. First thing is that one of those pollen cores, one of those bogs, deposited information from 12,000 years. So we know the history of vegetation of this area for the last 12,000 years. And in this period, the most important thing was that this area was continuously covered, or was continuously forested, was covered by dense forest vegetation throughout entire history, 12,000 years of history. And this information is represented by those light gray and dark gray areas. The dark gray area represents the ratio of open areas vegetation, light gray area, the densely wooded vegetation. So this is probably something that should end the discussion about the naturalness of the forest, but actually usually it doesn't, and it needs further explanation what is behind this picture. Now we know that the forest has the history of being a forest for 12,000 years. Why is it unique? Why is it special? It is special. When you consider the history of forest vegetation throughout Europe, not even in the last 12,000 years, even the last 6,000 years is enough to get the gist of the uniqueness of this place, of our forest. The first picture from 6,000 years ago shows European continent covered almost entirely with dense forests, reaching almost 100% of forestation of the area. But then this forest cover depletes, maybe not rapidly, but steadily towards the current situation when the majority of the continent is devoid of trees. And to give you a better context of what we are looking at, let me show you what human history coincided with those forest changes. So 6,000 years ago, when the European continent was covered by a dense forest, it coincided more or less with the invention of writing. 5,000 years ago, when the forest cover started depleting, it was more or less the time when Egyptians erected their most massive and important pyramids. Then 4,000 years ago, when we see an actual significant depletion of forest cover in Europe, this coincided with Bronze Age and beginning of huge agricultural revolution in Europe. Then 3,000 years ago, the classical antiquity, ancient Greeks and Romans, actually put a lot of effort into getting rid of forests throughout their part of Europe. Then 2,000 years ago, you probably can guess what kind of historical things happened around that time. The forest cover of Europe was, I wouldn't say gone, but the dense cover forest was to be seen only in certain parts of Europe. And 1,000 years ago, just before the outbreak of industrial revolution, just before the rapid rise of human population, I would say that we had the least forests in the history of the continent. On this background, Białowieża Forest remained this single point that was never devoid of trees. People never managed to cut Białowieża Forest down, to burn it down, to change it into anything else, any other environment. And it's amazing that this forest remained untouched, or relatively untouched, and I will talk about this untouched dichotomy later. But it's amazing that it remained until nowadays covering about 1,500 square kilometers. Now, of course, the forest is divided between Poland and Belarus, but still it's believed that its core area still holds the last remnants of pristine, temperate, lowland forests of Europe that predated everything that we know, that predated any civilization that we know or come from. And for me, as an environmental historian, this is a unique place to study because many factors. Because it was a royal forest, so a tradition of being a royal hunting ground and traditional royal protection is extremely important. It was the last refuge of European bison. It was actually the last place in Europe where the lowland population of European bison survived. And thanks to the long-lasting protection of the forest, the plethora, numerous remnants of past human presence survived and still persist in the forest. So a person like me could not be happier to study a place like that. And those studies included different sources and methods, and still I'm trying to combine all them into more or less coherent picture, starting from archaeological excavations that were conducted together with Institute of Archaeology and Ethnology of Polish Academy of Sciences through archival research. And I'm a specialist in archival research, so I'm the person who sniffs all the dust from old books and documents, ending with documentation of traces in the field and different sorts of paleoecological studies, including those palynological studies I mentioned before. All this to answer a simple question: how come this is the only forest that survived, although it was surrounded by many other forests that are no longer there? Sometimes we know them only from historical sources. Sometimes we see the name on the map, but the name now is connected with a small patch of the forest that has nothing to do with the original primeval, pristine, virgin forest of the lost age. But the Białowieża forest is still here. And to answer this question, I must once again reach to palynological research, but this time from a different core, from a different bog, from a strict reserve of Białowieża National Park, and showing not 12,000 years of the history of the forest, but only humble 2,000 years. But I think it's enough, especially considering the fact that the majority of historical information that we have comes from those 2,000 years. And I guess it's enough to explain and understand the uniqueness of the forest and the challenges it must have faced in the past, and all those fortunate events or circumstances that combined together to allow this forest to survive. So what does this palynological research tell us? From the very obvious information that I mentioned before, what was the ratio between the arboreal forest vegetation and open areas vegetation? So this does not change here. The forest throughout the last 2,000 years was a forest. It was never an open area. In fact, the openness never reached more than 15%, which is amazing on the backdrop of other European forests that almost all of them went through a phase of total deforestation and change into another environment. Then this graph shows us the changes in tree composition of the forest, but more importantly at this point, it also shows human traces, human footprints in form of plants that usually accompanied human settlements, in form of remnants of cereal, agricultural cultivation, and also in form of charcoal that is sometimes connected with natural disturbances, but in majority of cases is rather connected with us humans, burning and using fire for different purposes. And on this backdrop, using archival and archaeological sources, we were able to identify the periods of human presence, and I call them human footprints, in the history of Białowieża Primeval Forest. And now I will try to quickly walk you through all those footsteps, taking short breaks at the crucial points in the history of the forest and maybe explaining what happened and how could have it all been going wrong, but actually went well. So in ancient times, we discovered two waves of settlers. The first wave, connected with Baltic tribes, came here around 1st century BC and stayed not longer than until the end of 1st century AD. So not longer than 200 years. Then there was a gap in human presence in the forest, at least 2 centuries without any human settlements, and then again, Germanic tribes came, settled the forest, erected small villages, and left in the 5th century AD. We don't know why the Baltic tribes disappeared, but we more or less know why Germanic tribes disappeared. They just moved towards the Black Sea. That's not important. What is important is that those tribes possessed quite huge knowledge about how to cultivate the land, how to cut the forest down and utilize it in different ways, because they possess the knowledge how to smelt ore collected on forest rivers, how to produce their own tools and weapons, how to keep their own animals, as evidenced by the bones that we found in our trenches, archaeological excavation. The most impressive things that we discovered actually were not such impressive. Those were burial gifts left with the dead, including bronze fibulas, knives, glass beds, belt buckles, and this one single tiny small copper knife. And I had such great expectations connected with this knife, because I had a theory that it was used for body shaving. And I thought, this is amazing, guys. This is the first known example of this tradition of body shaving surviving the downfall of Roman Empire and thriving in the Germanic tribes, barbaric tribes. But obviously, as you see from my face, that was not the case. It was just used for skinning small animals. But anyways, I had great expectations as a young researcher. Not important. What's important is that when the Germanic tribes, shaved or not, left the forest, there was another gap in human presence. And us, Slavs, settled the forest only in the 8th, 9th century for a short period of time. Then somehow we left. Maybe it was too cold or too expensive. And then we Slavs came back in the 11th century AD. And those were quite different tribes, quite different waves of settlers. We can distinguish them mainly because of the different burial rite. So the older one had cremation burials, which meant the bodies were burned and then the ashes were scattered around the forest. And the picture on the left depicts one of the burials in this rite. And the second wave of settlers used inhumation burials, inhumation graves with skeletons that are still present beneath the ground of Białowieża Forest. But what was similar to previous cultures that settled the forest is that they probably led a very modest life, because the most important and most expensive things that they gave their dead for their last voyage actually turned out to be just a small headband ornaments, silver or bronze, which was nothing compared to other burial gifts from the same period, but from more civilized areas of Europe. Unfortunately, no small knives for shaving, but okay, I'm fine with that. It goes along the general idea of Slavs from medieval chronicles that depicted them as very hairy. Jokes aside, when you look at the timeline of human presence and no human presence in the forest, you can notice a very peculiar, interesting pattern. So that the waves of settlers, and by settlers I also mean of human impact, and it doesn't matter how big the impact was. Was it only collecting mushrooms, which I don't believe so? Was it erecting villages, creating small fields and cultivating them, keeping animals, hunting? And this, I believe, was true. It didn't matter that much, because all those periods of human pressure were broken by periods of no human presence. And I believe that's the crucial point in the history of the forest, because those breaks in human presence allowed the forest to regenerate. So when the next culture came to settle the forest 2 or 3 centuries later, they entered almost natural, almost primeval, almost untouched forest, at least a forest with no visible human intervention. But this history, this part of the story ends at the 11th century. What happened next? Well, we Slavs stayed here, and Białowieża Primeval Forest entered the stage of written historical sources. And from those sources we know that already in medieval times it belonged to Lithuanian Grand Dukes. And after the merger, the union between Poland and Lithuania, this forest started to serve as a royal hunting ground. This started in 14th century and lasted until the 18th century. The status of royal hunting ground brings into mind a place that is frequently visited by kings or monarchs who hunt or shoot at everything that moves and overuse, overexploit the place. At least it brings this picture to my mind. And it's a very useful picture because I can delete it immediately by saying that I checked carefully all possible sources for all traces of royal visits to the forest. And it turns out that despite the status of royal hunting ground, the Lithuanian and Polish monarchs actually visited this place quite rarely, on average each 15 years. So even if they would overhunt it during this short stay, I think the significance of royal hunts was not very big, especially considering the fact that along with the status of royal hunting ground came the status of protected area. But one might ask, Tomasz, but how come they visited the forest so rarely? Fear not, I have an answer, probably. It was all because of the location, the remote location of the forest. So when you look at the map This is a current map of Poland and adjacent Lithuania. But just imagine those two countries, together with Belarus and Ukraine, formed a huge commonwealth of both nations in the 15th, 16th, 17th century. And the capitals of those two countries were Kraków and Vilnius. And when you draw a line between Kraków and Vilnius going through Białowieża Forest, you notice that the forest is more or less in the middle of that road. And from written sources, we know that it took a week to go to Białowieża from Kraków or Vilnius in summer, and even 2 weeks to go there in winter. So organizing such a hunt was a chore, maybe even bigger than organizing this conference. And I believe that was one of the factors why this forest was not overhunted, was not overused as a royal hunting ground. I mentioned the status of protected forest, which was way more important in my eyes, because the system of protection of a royal hunting ground was quite sophisticated and smart, in my opinion. The forest itself was divided in several sections. In the last stage, 13 sections. Each of those sections had a village on the border of the forest, and in those villages, royal people, royal beaters, guards, riflemen were settled. Their first purpose was to organize or help in organizing royal hunts. But since those hunts did not happen that often, their main duty became protecting the forest from any unauthorized access. And it was quite an army of people that did just that. It was almost 300 people in the 17th century and way over 300 people in the 18th century. And again, one might now have a picture of a forest that was surrounded by a wall and nobody was granted access inside the forest, not even speaking about utilizing the forest in any way. But quite the contrary. I said the system was quite sophisticated and smart because it allowed people to come in. It did not allow to produce timber, to cut any trees. It did not allow to hunt, but it allowed for an entire variety of traditional forest uses, from haymaking through beekeeping, fishing in forest rivers, cattle pasturing in forest meadows, gathering firewood, mushrooms, and forest fruits, to maybe more destructive types of utilization introduced in the 17th and especially 18th century, charcoal burning, wood, tar, and potash burning. But fortunately enough, those types of uses did not last very long. But what lasted the longest and was present for the longest period were two types of utilization. Haymaking in forest meadows, especially along river valleys, that happened annually for centuries, had probably the biggest impact on the forest ecosystems themselves. Because not only did it enlarge the areas of riverside meadows that were mowed by local people. Well, haymaking means just entering the forest and mowing the meadows and then creating haystacks and waiting for the forest roads to be solid enough, to freeze enough, to go with the carriage inside the forest, collect the hay, and bring it back to the village outside the forest to feed your cows. Sometimes this hay was never removed from the forest and stayed for the entire winter when the conditions were not suitable for driving carriage there. And quite soon it was observed that ungulates utilized those haystacks very eagerly, especially European bison. And actually, in the year 1700, it became an official law to leave 1/4 of hay produced in the forest in form of haystacks for the purposes of additional feeding of European bison. But also, just imagine that this annual mowing of riverside meadows must have enriched the vegetation of those meadows. So not only did bison and other ungulates were offered cool source of additional fodder in winter, but also their feeding conditions in the vegetation season was enriched. The second most widespread type of use was beekeeping, traditional beekeeping. I'm keeping track of time. Take it easy, take it easy. Traditional beekeeping meant entering the forest, selecting a tree, a tall tree, usually a pine, climbing the tree, carving an artificial hollow in the tree, and then attracting wild bees and tending those bees while collecting honey and wax. quite complicated deal, but that was not all that beekeepers did. They also frequently caused small-scale ground fires around their beekeeping areas. And it was on purpose. It was not because they were careless. It was on purpose because this allowed them to better protect their precious beehive trees by ensuring that no burning material is left lying around, and also by ensuring that no other trees would overgrow their precious beehive trees. Also, this frequent burning, small fires started in the forest, enriched the vegetation, especially flowering herbs, which in turn allowed bees to produce better honey. And we all love honey, right? And this type of use has led also to creation of a very specific type of forest landscape. This type of landscape was last noted by the end of the 19th century, and it was called Lado forest. And actually it was made up strictly of old pine trees and almost nothing else. And after 19th century, it started disappearing, and it's not to be found in the forest anymore. And I believe it was due to the fact that, firstly, the traditional beekeeping was removed from the forest, and secondly, strict fire protection was introduced, and this prescribed burning was no longer allowed in the forest. Anyways, I mentioned the 19th century and changes this period brought, and it was quite an important period, because you might not know, but the forest had a different owner back then. In the year 1795, Poland was erased from the map of Europe, and a huge chunk of this country fell under Russian rule. So Russian Empire just grabbed this area and took it over and introduced completely new type of management and completely new goal. And this goal was to quickly turn Białowieża Primeval Forest into a timber manufacturer, to be honestly, using the German forestry textbooks. Still, nevertheless, some forms of traditional utilization persisted due to the fact that the local people still wanted to utilize their meadows for hay, they wanted to utilize their beehives for honey and wax, they wanted to pasture their cattle inside the forest, and they wanted to collect their mushrooms, fruits, and other forest products, although with some problems. The saddest thing is that the common knowledge that you can find even online says that Białowieża Primeval Forest already in the 19th century underwent heavy logging and plantation, that actually the Russians succeeded to introduce the modern forestry management based on German textbooks. And I understand why. Because the situation was dire in the year 1795. Białowieża Primeval Forest was treated as the war treasure. It was captured, divided into parts, and those parts were given to different generals that had their role in extinguishing Polish resistance. One of those generals was given one of the 13 districts of Białowieża Forest, and the first map depicts the situation before the general received this district, and the second map on the right depicts the same forest after only 5 years. So it's easy to assume that this fate was written for the entire forest. But we are meeting in Białowieża Primeval Forest, right? So definitely something happened. And this something was rather a network of different factors than just one decisive thing, moment, or person appearing and saving everybody. First factor was that actually German and French philosophers of the era came up with the idea of primeval, virgin, undisturbed, untouched forest for different reasons. French philosophers by observing the depletion of natural forests in Europe, the Germans because they wanted to ground their idea of great German nation in a primeval forest, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that both nations, both countries developed the idea of primeval forest as an utopian idea that had no designation in actual world. But to their surprise, when members of both philosophy schools from France and Germany visited this area, they were surprised to find that actually something like this ideal, utopic primeval forest exists. One of those researchers, naturalists, was Jean-Emmanuel Gilibert, that visited the forest before the fall of Poland, and he noted that a naturalist delving into the depths of this forest as old as the earth it covers searches in vain for traces of degeneration of nature. The other person that visited the forest shortly after the fall of Poland was Julius Brinken, a German forester and naturalist, and he, impressed by the site of Białowieża Primeval Forest, noted that numerous large remnants of these primeval forests still exist in Lithuania today. In the Białowieża forest, we see one of the most important and distinctive remnants of these ancient forest areas. And after that, big number of European naturalists wanted to come to Białowieża, to experience this primeval forest by themselves, to describe it, to study it. So that was one of the factors that made Russian administrators think about the fate of the forest, but it was not the decisive factor, because they still wanted mass timber production rather than a bunch of naturalists running around studying the forest. And I think the forestry administration has this in common, both in Russian period and nowadays. Anyways, it was not all. I mentioned several factors overlapping here and deciding the fate of Białowieża Primeval Forest. The other factors was the absence of surveys and maps of the area. So it took a long time for the Russian administrators to even map the forest precisely. And to be more precise, it took them 40 years to produce the first precise map, actual map of Białowieża Primeval Forest. Then secondly, the Polish guards, the Polish forest personnel that still persisted here after the fall of Poland, they were not very obedient in following Russian orders, which was very fortunate from the point of view of forest survival. Then Russians learned that there's a peculiar species present in this forest that is not present anywhere else. And obviously this species was European bison. And some of the Russian administrators did not want to put their lives in danger in front of the Tsar when he is informed that due to their actions this precious species went extinct. So they've put some effort into stopping introducing modern forestry management for the sake of preserving European bison population here. Then thirdly, there was the case of traditional utilization of the forest. And although it might not sound like the decisive factor saving the forest, I believe it was one of the most important things. And it's best depicted by the term culturally modified trees. And those trees were usually beehive trees, but also other trees that had pieces of their trunk removed by continuous chopping. Year after year, month after month, local people were very keen to go to the forest and chop parts of the trunk for the purposes of kindling fire back in their houses. And the trees, especially pines, produced a lot of resin to cover this chopped area so that the people would return later on to find even better kindling material. And this traditional use of trees continued for centuries. Actually, most probably it did not harm the trees because some of those chopped trees still survive into the forest, but it did harm the aims of Russian administration because it was their point of honor to get rid of those trees in the first place and then introduce the modern forestry management. And there are several written sources about that, about the resources they've put into mapping and counting all those trees and then finding people willing to go into deep forest and cut those trees and remove them from Białowieża Primeval Forest. Fortunately, all this commotion lasted long enough for the first Tsar to come to Białowieża and hunt here in the year 1860. Just imagine, 65 years after capturing this area, they still were not able to do anything except from introducing short bursts, short periods of timber production with breaks of no timber extraction at all due to the fact that they believed it's harmful for European bison. So it lasted long enough, this struggle of power, for the Tsars to decide that actually this forest needs to be turned into a Tsar's hunting reserve. And from the year 1860, this was the new goal of Russian forestry administration. And it lasted until the First World War. It ensured the continuation of the forest, the survival of the forest, but also brought some downsides. Okay, maybe erecting a cool-looking palace in the middle of Białowieża was not a downside. And for your information, this palace is no longer present in the forest. It was brought down just after the Second World War. But introduction of so-called modern game management was actually, from our perspective, quite harmful, because it meant an absurd promotion of ungulates. And by absurd promotion, I mean protecting them and feeding them, additionally feeding them for 8 months each year with all sorts of additional fodder. And at the same time, it meant eradicating, persecuting all predators. And by all predators, I mean the big and small birds of prey. Did they have any impact on ungulates or not? It did not matter. What mattered is, was it predator or not? If it was a predator, it needed to go. Fortunately, Russians were not very effective in the majority of cases. Unfortunately, they were very effective in the case of brown bear. And the last brown bear was shot in Białowieża in the year 1879. In case of European bison, this form of protection meant strict monitoring of bison population, which is very fortunate for us researchers because we have long-lasting data on bison numbers. It also meant this absurd level of additional feeding. And also it means something strange, because in the middle of the 19th century, it was reported that European bison population reached a number of 2,000 specimens, and then the population rapidly dropped. Very strangely, this drop coincided with the first visit of the Tsar in the forest, and maybe, I don't know, with the Tsar observing himself that there is no way that 2,000 bison are present in the forest, because he had trouble finding even one for his hunting purposes. So maybe it was just Russian propaganda, maybe other factors. All we know is that the stable population of European bison throughout the 19th century counted more or less 500, 700 specimens. And most probably this population would thrive on and survive until nowadays, if not the outbreak of the First World War and chaos connected with the war, which resulted in rapid decrease of European bison and actually in killing off the last specimen of the species in the 1919. I mentioned the First World War. The year 1915 was the first moment when the massive timber extraction was introduced by German troops during the war. Only small portion of the old traditional uses survived during the 20th century, but fortunately a new type, maybe of not traditional, but this positive way of forest utilization emerged, and that was tourism and education. But first, the sad things. First World War, German troops capturing the forest and bringing the technology and will to extract as much timber as possible. And for this purpose, they have built, using the slave labor of local people and prisoners of war, a network of railroads running through the forest. This seems very unfortunate, but there was one ray of hope among this darkness, and that was the voice that maybe not all parts of the forest should be put under such heavy exploitation. And this voice came from Germany, to make the situation even more strange. And this voice was heard, and part of the forest was excluded from exploitation. Fortunately enough, the war ended soon, and those parts excluded from exploitation were later on proclaimed nature reserves. One of those reserves was Białowieża National Park, created in 1921. But outside of those small reserves, the exploitation continued with first attempts at artificial regeneration and first introduction of monoculture plantation, especially spruce. So it's important to note that this type of modern forestry was introduced only a century ago. Not 2, not 3, not 5 centuries ago. In the interwar period, a good thing happened, because thanks to the fact that European bison was treated as a royal gift and sent to zoos and private reserves throughout Europe, both by Polish kings and later by Russian tsars, some of the specimens survived. And those specimens were used later on to reintroduce the species to Białowieża Primeval Forest. And the first European bison returned to the forest in the year 1929. The similar movement, the similar attempt was made in the case of brown bear. And the reintroduction process started in the year 1937, and it was very promising. 2 cubs were born free living in the forest, and probably would thrive, would survive, if not the Second World War. Firstly, the forest was captured by Soviets, then by Germans, who brought the idea of creating Hermann Göring's hunting reserve. And this meant exclusion of all people, of all local people from the forest and persecuting them, but also meant introducing some crazy ideas. First of those ideas was connected with so-called heck cattle, and heck cattle was announced as the reintroduced or rescued aurochs by German zoologist Lutz Heck, a Nazi, by the way, and he claimed to have rescued a species that went extinct in the 17th century, curiously enough, by crossbreeding different breeds of cows. Very curious, but for Göring it was enough, and he decided to bring back these aurochs to Białowieża Forest, the Reichsjagdgebiet of Göring, and a herd of those poor cattle were released in the forest, and soon enough they disappeared, and the disappearance is covered with a mystery. We don't know what happened, but I guess the local starving population had a role to play in this disappearance of those poor cows. The second crazy idea that Germans brought was much more dangerous, because they believed that the forest lacks the big predator, brown bear, so that they released circus bears into the wild, and this led to tragic consequences. Those bears approached people, attacked people, started killing people. In return, the locals killed off all bears in the forest, including the ones coming from this reintroduction process, started in 1937. After the Second World War, the forest was split between Poland and Belarus, and in both parts the exploitation continued. But still, another ray of hope, the old growth remnants of the natural forest persisted, and persisted long enough for the new movement to appear, the movement to protect, to educate, to introduce more and more tourists to the forest. And this movement became especially visible in the 90s of the last century, with the creation of new nature reserves, with the enlargement of Białowieża National Park, with introduction of new educational and tourism programs. And I wish I could end my talk with this slide, because it's very optimistic and it draws a clear line to a bright future of this forest serving as a place for study, for enjoyment, for education. But unfortunately, the picture is not as simple as that. Last decade or so brought many different factors that are very dangerous for the forest, from the reaction to the bark beetle outbreak. By the way, this outbreak happened in the areas that were artificially planted in the beginning of 20th century, which closes the circle of not very smart ideas, through the difficult political situation on the border between Poland and Belarus, and of course up to the climate change that is having and will have even greater impact on the forest ecosystems. And I just wonder, what role do we play in this process, and how the environmental historians of the future will evaluate our times? Will somebody like me stand up in front of the audience all wearing 3D goggles and with their necks bent because of the smartphones, and they will say like, yes, that was the crucial moment, and everything could have gone wrong, but fortunately, this and this happened, and the forest survived, and now we have year 3000, and we can enjoy this primeval forest. And actually this is not as stupid and naive as it sounds, because if you can learn anything from this environmental history of Białowieża Primeval Forest, is a very simple message. If you leave the forest, time and space, if you let it be for a moment, brief moment of 100 years or two, it will regenerate just perfectly. And in no time, you will see no human traces there. It just needs time and space. And I hope you will see this ray of hope, of bright future, in the next days when you visit the forest yourselves. And I really hope that Białowieża Primeval Forest will live up to the great expectations that you probably have for it. Thank you very much.